Right, folks, we're just given a few moments at the top here for Zoom to let everybody in before we get started. If you are already in tonight's webinar with us, you can open up your chat window and find some information about how to purchase books by tonight's featured authors. Good evening and welcome to tonight's live online author event with Greenlight Bookstore. I'm Chelsea from Greenlight, and we're thrilled to host tonight's event with Nguyen, presenting his new book, Things We Lost to the Water. He'll be talking with Megha Majumdar, so you're in for an excellent time. Before we start, I just want to say a huge thanks to Eric, Megha, and the team at Knopf for making this happen, and to all of you for showing up. Though we're not able to host events in our store spaces, our community of authors and readers is still here. We're grateful for your support and for the chance to make this space for conversation and connection. Now, just a few housekeeping things. In our Zoom webinar tonight, you can see and hear the speakers, but they cannot see or hear you. They can see that you're here though, and there are a couple different ways you can interact with the authors and with each other throughout tonight's event, which we highly encourage. The first is the chat, which you can find by clicking on the icon that looks like one speech balloon. You're welcome to post your comments and thoughts in the chat. That is a great way to show your appreciation for the author and interact with fellow attendees. If you have a specific question you'd like to have answered by the author, please post that question in the Q&A module. You can find it by clicking on the icon that looks like two speech balloons. We'll be pulling questions only from the Q&A to be answered in the later part of the program. And importantly, tonight's featured book, Things We Lost to the Water, is available for sale from Greenlight Bookstore. You can shop in person in our bookstore locations, noon to 7 p.m. every day of the week, and you can purchase Eric's book and many others on site. Or order online at greenlightbookstore.com for a quick pickup at the store or for shipping anywhere in the US. I'll drop that buy link in the chat. If you care about supporting the careers of authors and the ongoing existence of independent bookstores, buying tonight's featured book is a great way to show your support. Our interviewer tonight is Megha Majumdar. She was born and raised in Kolkata, India. She moved to the United States to attend college at Harvard University, followed by graduate school in social anthropology at Johns Hopkins University. She works as an editor at Catapult and lives in New York City. A Burning is her first book. She'll be speaking with our featured author, Nguyen. He has an MFA in creative writing from the State University in Louisiana and is the editor-in-chief for diacritics.org. He lives in Washington, D.C. His new book, Things We Lost to the Water, is a stunning debut novel about an immigrant Vietnamese family who settles in New Orleans and struggles to remain connected to one another as their lives are inextricably reshaped. The book has been praised by many acclaimed authors, including Nguyen Phan K. Mai, Charles Yu, by Strong Washburn, and Viet Thanh Nguyen, who says this is an elemental book of water for sure, but also of other elements of life, including love and loss. Vietnamese people know all about these elements, coming from a country whose entire length is bordered by a sea, and from a history saturated with loss. Love is one element that has enabled their survival, but sometimes at a cost. Nguyen's powerful novel ripples and gleams with the unpredictable flow and surge of love, which, like water, can drown us or sustain us. From a war to a hurricane, from an ocean to a flood, Things We Lost to the Water proves itself to be a novel that sustains us. Eric is going to start us off with a reading from the book, and then he'll be talking with Megha and with all of you. Eric, please take it away.
Great. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you, Greenlight, for having me here. It's really exciting. So I'm going to read from the second chapter early in my book. I guess what you need to know is that Huong, the mother of the family, has just arrived for a couple of weeks into the US in New Orleans, and she's being conveyed to a family to live with temporarily, another Vietnamese family called the Mins. And this is her first encounter with them. The van continued down the long stretch of road for another 5 minutes before slowing down into a turn. In front of a house, a fat Vietnamese man waited. Mr. Min, the priest chuckled. Mr. Min waved when he saw them. Welcome to America, Mr. Min shouted as the priest parked the car. He pulled the door open and bowed extravagantly, making a show of the gesture. His large hands came at her necks and grabbed her wrists. He shook them furiously. You will like it here very much, he said. It's America. We're all friends here. His face glowed red. How unlike her husband he was. Cong was thin and suave, bookish and reserved, and above all, neat. This man was chubby and rude, drunk and loud, above all, loud. She could picture Mr. Min spending his time at bars, his poor wife coming to get him at 3 in the morning. She thought, not without bitterness, that they never would have been friends in Vietnam. They were two different types of people, a friendship had little chance. We're all friends here, Mr. Min repeated, confidently caressing her sloppily, stupidly. It made Huong feel little, like a bug waiting to be squashed. She held on to her baby boy and motioned for her other son to stand closer. The wife, who noticed her now, stood aside as if this were the regular order of things. He used to be a police officer, the wife said in her scratchy voice. Now he drinks. She laughed, and Huong didn't know if she was supposed to laugh out of courtesy or just nod sadly in agreement. She decided on doing neither and stayed silent and stiff. Very well, the wife said. Then in English, she said something to the priest, shook his hand, and grabbed Huong's suitcase. The priest drove away. This way, she said. Huong walked up the porch steps and crossed the threshold. Right away, she smelled the rotting wood, disarming at first, but only because it came so suddenly. The lights were off, and in the darkness, the room felt vast and empty. As her eyes adjusted, she realized the room was small and arranged at its center were a floral fabric sofa, a white plastic chair, and a small television. A fan spun lazily above. The wife told Huong it was a shotgun house. Nguyen, she clarified. See, she said. She placed the suitcase down and mimed the shape of a gun with one hand. With the other, she held her wrist. Closing one eye, she looked through an invisible scope, and the appearance of intense concentration fell onto her face. For a few seconds, she stood silently, so focused on something in the distance that Huong looked toward where the wife stared too. Then, psh, the imitated sound of gunfire. It was so unexpected, but also so childish. Huong jumped back and felt stupid for doing so, like a child tricked in a schoolyard. She immediately hated the Mins, their poverty, their obnoxiousness, their immaturity. See, the wife said, a house for guns. She made the motion of dusting off her hands. But you don't have to worry about that here. No war, not here, not ever. Of course, said Huong, composing herself. That's all in the past now, the wife said. Yes, said Huong, the past. Just stay out of the doorways to be on the safe side. She broke out into a cackle, though Huong didn't find any of it funny. And that's it.
That was great. Thank you so much, Eric. I'm so glad you introduced us to Huong, the mother. She's a character that I want to ask about, but first I'll just take a second to say welcome everybody who's watching. Thank you for joining us. I am so excited about this book. If I can just take a second to gush about it and embarrass you, Eric. I really loved this novel. It's so beautiful. It's so lively. It's so gentle. It has these big questions about home and family and migrations and secrets and betrayals. It has love stories. It has been praised, I think, everywhere from the New York Times to BuzzFeed. I think I saw Roxane Gay loved it. So I hope everybody watching will get a copy from Greenlight today. And circling back to Huong, you know, this past Sunday when it was Mother's Day, one of the mothers that I was thinking about was her. She's a character who really stays with me. I ached for her when I was reading this book. Can you introduce us to her and to writing this character?
Well, Huong is basically the first character I wrote for this book. I had in my mind that this book would be like her story when I first draft, and you know how first drafts eventually change. But she is a Vietnamese refugee. She lived most of her life up until like her mid-20s, lived in Vietnam. She was in Vietnam the wife of a professor who taught French literature at the local university in South Vietnam when the South and North and the communist North were separated. But eventually her life and the life of her family changes once the North eventually gets to the South, controls Saigon, and the war is over. Communists come to rule the country, and she and her husband have to first flee to the countryside, and eventually, because of the living conditions there, especially for the wife of someone who was considered an intellectual, of someone who taught foreign literature, it was dangerous for them, so they decide to leave with their one son and their unborn child. But at the last minute, when they're at the coast about to board the boat, as many people left back then, they left on like small fishing boats. Her husband's hand slipped and the boat moves on without him. Throughout the novel, she'll try to get back in touch with him, but there's no really success in that. And what she's left with is trying to build a life for herself and her now two sons that she has in this different place from she ever known, a place that doesn't speak the language that she has. And she really has to start all over again, basically, at least to her, by herself.
How did you come to the idea for this book?
I think for the longest time, I wanted to write about my parents and their generation, the refugee generation who fled Vietnam. But growing up, like my parents didn't really talk about that. They kind of left it behind, kind of like shushed me when I asked questions. So I've always been curious about it. It wasn't until I started like graduate school that I've like sat myself down like, hey, I'm gonna write something about this experience just as a way for myself to learn more about what they've been through and kind of put myself in their shoes. And I guess this novel kind of bloomed from that one, is to discover my family's like hidden history that I wasn't told. So through fiction, I was able to imagine what refugees went through.
So you mentioned that, you know, there's the mother and then there are two brothers that we follow throughout this book. And one thing that I really loved is that the two brothers have very different paths. One of them gets involved with a gang. The other one falls in love with literature. Can you talk about writing these two very different brothers?
I think like in my mind, they were different in the first, like I wanted them to be very different just because as a writer, you kind of want your characters kind of separate. And like if you put them into like polar opposites, I feel like that's a very easy way to not get them mixed up. But I felt like for me at least when I was writing them, I was like kind of picturing like different generations of like the Vietnamese diaspora. Dom, the older brother, I felt like he kind of represented he does represent like this kind of person who kind of left very early as a child. In this case, he left when he was around 5 years old. He has that memory of growing up in Vietnam, of having a father, and throughout the whole novel, he's really trying to get back in touch with that side of him in any way possible. And for a while, it becomes like the gangs that he gets involved with because they're a Vietnamese gang and they represent like the kind of Vietnamese-ness that he kind of want to cling on to. On the other side, we have his brother Ben, originally Ben. He changes his name to be more Americanized. And I see him as someone, even though he is born abroad in the book, he's born in a refugee camp, he kind of really has no idea what that's like. He has no idea what Vietnam was like. So he kind of represents like the Vietnamese American, who, like from my generation, who's kind of born here and only really knew of the American way of life. Like Vietnam is just like a completely foreign place for them. And for him, I felt like literature for him was just a kind of way to like expand his the life he lived. He kind of sees New Orleans as kind of this small town that he does really want to leave. He kind of sees himself as an American, like paving his own path forward. And eventually he does leave, hopefully I'm not giving away too much. But like he also has this glimmering that he wants to learn more about his own past, his father in particular, which is also what draws him towards literature because his father was also a professor of literature.
Mm-hmm. And they are all part of the Vietnamese community in New Orleans, which is written with such richness. All the individuals have their own paths. Even the minor characters are so distinct. I'm so curious about your work, your process for writing this community, and what drew you to write about this community in New Orleans.
I think at first I really tried to kind of make it more aligned for my biography. So at first, like in my mind, I had it set like in the DC area where I grew up. But like I hit a block and I was in Louisiana at the time for my MFA program, and where I was, Lake Charles is about 3 hours west of New Orleans. So I made a lot of like trips on the weekends to New Orleans just because it was there. It was like the big city. Like how could you resist, really? And from my time there, I got to learn that there was a Vietnamese community that I didn't really know about. I mean, growing up, I didn't really associate Vietnamese people like in New Orleans. Like we have communities like in San Jose in California, in Orange County, we have communities in Houston. But like New Orleans for me was their presence was new there. And I kind of through going out to the eastern part of the city where most of them settled, I got to know their stories, how they got there, the community they built. And from there, I kind of saw like similarities from like my own family and their community. So I felt that was like a great path forward to write the story, to make it entirely fiction. Yeah, from research, most of my research is just talking to people, just being around them and seeing what they're willing to share with me.
That's amazing. That's almost like, I mean, that is doing field work, and yeah, that's incredible. I want to turn to this quote, which I think tells us quite a bit about one of the major themes of this book. And the quote goes, all his life, it felt like she was trying to shape him, to mold him like a piece of clay into the man he's never met. Didn't she understand he was his own person? He had his own flesh and blood and mind. And this is, of course, a son and talking about mother. And this tussle between devotion to the family and seeking freedom in finding one's own path. I felt that that was so powerfully present in the book. What drew you to that conflict?
I think just like, I guess from my own personal life and then like seeing the lives of like other, I guess second generation, I guess you could call it me second generation. I was born here, my parents weren't. Um, Vietnamese American who are kind of all their life kind of trying to balance this faithfulness to their family and their Vietnamese community, but also trying to pave the way for themselves. I feel like a lot of us Vietnamese American of my generation, um, like we want to be part of that family, to have like that Vietnameseness, like we're proud to be Vietnamese. But at the same time, we're American, really, like, and like any other American, we want to like we have like this idea that we can pave our own paths, that we can be whoever we want to be. And I feel like both of my characters, not Ben from the passage that you read, really do try to pave their own paths in different ways. It kind of leads them in like we talked about in different direction, one towards a gang, one towards literature. And I feel like, well, I hope like their path, their struggles to find their own paths while trying to balance their life and their family resonates with like other people, because I felt like that was something of myself that I put into the novel, even though it was not like anything biographical about me. I feel like that feeling of having to balance a traditional family life with what is expected of me versus what I wanted in life. In my case, like my parents wanted me to become like a doctor or a lawyer, and then I became a writer.
For everybody who is just joining us, we're of course talking about Things We Lost to the Water, which is a beautiful novel that I hope you will buy from Greenlight today. And in a few minutes, we will start taking your questions. So as you're listening, if questions come up for you, please do put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and we will start looking at them soon. One thing that I was really struck by in this book, you mentioned that, you know, the book starts off with this profound loss. The family has to leave their husband/father behind. There is such great loss in this book, but at the same time, there is so much lightness. The book does not feel weighed down by it. And I guess I don't have a smart question about it. I just want to ask, how did you do it?
Um, I'm not sure. I feel like part of it was like trying to push away from like kind of mainstream ideas of like minority experiences, particularly like the Vietnamese American experience. I feel like trauma is usually the defining point in a lot of like people of colors in their narrative. Um, but like I feel like there's so much more to that, of course. As like people of color, we experience joy as well as like having our own trauma. So I feel like even though I wanted to address the trauma of like going through war, escaping a family, a country, I wanted to like have like my characters experience like those joys of like finding friendship. Like Ben, the character, has a friend that he kind of makes develop a friendship with, named Addie, and she's there's a scene that they're playing marbles and they play a trick on these other girls, and they're laughing their butts off because like they made the girls fall. And I feel like those are like the moments of like regular joy in the book that I feel doesn't have to do anything with the trauma that they have. Even if that trauma, that loss is like always part of them, they are still capable of feeling joy, making friendship, making memories, having relationships, and moving on while at the same time carrying the burden of loss with them.
Yeah. And one of the other big themes that I wanted to ask you about is there's a character who says, I'm going to butcher it now, but something about how it takes a lifetime to make a place lived in. And there are these big questions about home. What does home mean? How did your ideas of home change, if they did, while you were working on this novel?
I think like I've always had this one concept of home, of like being, I guess, as cliche it is, like wherever the family is, you have a home. But I think through writing this, I guess I learned more about like the Vietnamese refugee experience, and like how like you can so easily be torn away from your home. And I guess I wanted to explore like how that feeling is kind of to kind of lose everything, to like have this idea of home as not something really stable, that you can lose everything. I feel like that is really something that like it's on Huong's mind, the mother's mind a lot. Like in the first chapter, she's like she hear a hurricane alarm, and she rushes to get her sons and like move out of there as quickly as she can. So I feel like in a way, like my original definition of home as where the family is still there, but I see it as something that is kind of movable. Like you can flee a home and you can build a new one. And I think that's really what my characters do. They flee Vietnam. They really struggle to find a place in New Orleans to fit as not only like Vietnamese people in a largely like non-Vietnamese place, but also as like kind of outsiders in their own community, because like I made these characters like non-religious in a community that's largely Catholic, so that made them even more outsiders. So I feel like home is something that you also eventually build, and at the end I hope you see that Huong and the other characters kind of do build this home, and I think they learn how to build a home, and whatever they go through, they learn how to do it again.
Let's zoom out for a little bit. I want to ask you, and I guess this is two questions rolled into one, but what did you find most enjoyable and most challenging in writing this book?
I think what I found most enjoyable is just getting to know the characters. I mean, like for a while they were just like words on a page. I was just like trying to hit like deadlines in my MFA program to get like, the chapters out. But like the revision, like I kind of learned like who they were, and like what they would do, what they would not do, their likes or dislikes, and like I got to know them as people, as strangers that is to say, because at the end of the day, it's just like words on paper, and like in my mind, like I still kind of picture them like where their lives are like after like the novel's finished. Like in my head, like they're still alive, they're still living, even though I really have like no plans to like write any sequel. I feel like their story's done, but to me, like they live on, if that makes sense. So that was the joy of writing this book. I think the harder part was like the last chapters, when it addresses like Hurricane Katrina. I wasn't in New Orleans during Hurricane Katrina. It wasn't my story to tell, so I felt I had to be really respectful towards that story and try to make it as truthful as I can to that moment and to what people experience during that specific time and trauma. And how I went through that was really did my research, read books, read about encounters of people living through that experience, and also like writing in a way that's kind of distance myself as a writer from that experience in a way. The book is in third person, and I felt that gave me like the space I needed to say like, hey, this is not my experience, and I'm kind of just writing through I took a lot of research from like news clips and radio clips, and you do see that in the book. You have the radio announcements, you have the news announcement, and I hope through those lens I kind of give it more of an objective feel that's more accurate to how things were for people who went through Hurricane Katrina.
So did you start writing this book during your MFA and then you finished it afterwards? How long did it take you?
It took about 7 years altogether. My MFA program was 3 years, and I started writing it in my MFA program at the end of my first semester, and I kind of just stuck with it. I kind of wrote it out of order. When I started writing, I kind of knew what ending I want. But from there, it was just a question of how to get there. So I kind of jumped around with my characters a whole lot. Eventually, I went through a lot of drafts. I think it was like on the third or fourth draft by the time I graduated. I submitted it as my thesis. That helped me graduate my program. And after I graduated, I just kept on working at it, more revisions. And then when I thought it was in a good place, I reached out to agents. An agent eventually signed me on. We had more edits out of that. Eventually the book was sold and more edits out of that. So like, I guess the lesson to learn is that there's a lot of edits. Like when you think you're done, you're probably not done. So like, just keep that in mind if you're writing.
It's good advice. And then I guess zooming out a little bit more and speaking about edits, you worked as an editor. You're editor-in-chief of Diacritics. Can I ask how your editorial work interacts with your writing, if it does?
I think my editorial work and my writing work as a Vietnamese American critic, because before I was an editor-in-chief, I was like a contributing book reviewer for Diacritics. And I think my work there really informed like what kind of narrative I wanted to tell and like where I fit into, I guess, the Vietnamese American literary landscape. I guess I saw how like my own story differed, but also how it was very similar to other stories. And I also felt like reading through my work, reading other Vietnamese writers, usually like emerging writers who are sometimes releasing like maybe even like the first like short story with us. Like that kind of inspired me to continue like writing this story that I felt like didn't really fit into like a lot of other narratives, and just allowed me to like reclaim the Vietnamese American story as I saw it. So I would say like definitely editing, like reading other people's work, like active writers, like really inspired me and informed like what I eventually wrote.
That's fascinating that you do a lot of criticism as well. And maybe I'll ask a question about that before turning to the Q&As. I see questions are stacking up already. So thank you everybody for asking your questions. One follow-up that I have is, as a critic, you know, you're reading with a particular eye. Did you find that sharpened your goals for your own narrative?
I think so, because I feel like I've seen like stuff that other writers have done, and like just like in my head as a writer, I began to like think of like different ways to kind of tell kind of maybe the same story, because a lot of like, I wouldn't say all Vietnamese American diasporic stories are about like war and fleeing, but many are, and it gave me different ways to like how other authors have approached it, and seeing how like they did that, like just as a literary critic, first and foremost, just taking apart like the mechanisms of like building characters, building a narrative arc, really kind of helped me see how I can put my own story together, using like the techniques they might use or using techniques that haven't been tried before, and kind of like help me really find my own voice, either in unison as part of that literary community or as something different from that community, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay, turning to the questions that we have from everybody in the Q&A box. Here's a question which, you know, I will say only answer if you feel comfortable answering, and only to the degree that you're comfortable answering. Matthew Ng asks about your parents' reaction to the book.
My parents haven't read the book, mostly because I kind of separate my writer self from like my family self as a son, brother, what have you. But also they don't really read English. The book is only currently available in English, so they wouldn't really like come to it naturally, even if I put it into their hands. So like I hope like maybe they read it someday if it's available in Vietnamese. And I hope I did them proud, because like I said, like this story was kind of inspired by their own journey, and I hope like I got it right, basically.
Emily Lee asks about your field research that we talked about briefly. I'm wondering what that was like. Who did you talk to? How did you approach them? How did this experience of talking with folks shape you as a person in addition to the writing of the book? So any reflections you have on doing that field research?
So I think the field research is kind of like a big term. I felt like most of my conversations were like really casual, just like saying hi to people, saying like telling them like I'm visiting the area. I didn't know there was like a Vietnamese community there. All this, of course, like in very, very bad Vietnamese, because like I have a first grade level of Vietnamese. I'm sorry to my parents. But just like, I guess trying to just talking to them, just being like human with them. Like I didn't come to them as saying like, I'm gonna write a book, tell me everything you have. But I felt like one, like that's kind of disrespectful. And also two, I feel like people would not open up to that. So I came to them as like the son of other Vietnamese people, the son of refugees, trying to learn more about your community and like, hey, your community is very different from what I grew up with. Tell me about that. And at first, like people were like kind of hesitant again, because like I'm an outsider, I'm not from New Orleans. My Vietnamese is really bad. But I think eventually people kind of opened up to me or at least humored me. And I got like great like stories about like just the community there. And other than that field research of just being in New Orleans, getting the feel of New Orleans, just some reading, any reading I can do. There's like very little actually like reading on Eastern New Orleans, which is what where the Vietnamese community is based in New Orleans, on the eastern side. And there's very little reading about like the Vietnamese people there. So like there's some books like The Yellow House by Sarah Broom is about New Orleans East, which is a very good book I recommend. And there's also a documentary called A Village Called Versailles, which is about Versailles, which I based my own Versailles off of, and how they dealt with the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. And it's a very interesting documentary.
Those are great recommendations. Shanhu Lee asks, could you talk about your revision process for the book?
I think my revision process was kind of, I don't know how to explain it. I feel like I've went through so many revisions, like each revision is kind of different. Like some revisions, you cut down a lot. And then like the next revision, you would like add more. So I feel like I don't have like any hard and fast rule or experience for revision. I just like have this, I think all writers have an idea of like how the narrative would come out ideally. And it's just like working to get there and making sure it's like, I imagine it as like a piece of clay, and then you're like shaping it into what you want. Sometimes it means like taking off parts of that clay. Sometimes it means like adding on to it, and all like before it dries, which I guess is a metaphor for deadlines.
Here's a question. Oh, is Julie Stevenson your agent?
Yes, she's awesome.
She asks two questions. I think we already talked about diacritics, so I'll ask her other one. I wonder if Eric can speak to the support and influences that have been important to him in LGBTQ literature and the wider literary community, especially as it pertains to creating the character Ben.
I think I've had my like a good share of support from the LGBTQ community. I mean, like my first like workshop that I took was with Lambda Literary, which is an LGBTQ literary organization that hosts yearly a workshop for different genres of writing. And like I applied to it without really knowing what it meant to be a writer. And from there, I kind of learned like that, hey, you can become a writer if you kind of just wrote a lot, kind of focused on reading a lot and like taking that work of writing seriously. And from there, I really like found like the beginning of my journey as a writer and being a writer. What's the other part of the question? I didn't see it.
The other part of the question was how did this community become significant for you as you were writing the book, and especially as you were writing Ben?
I think apart from being part of like the LGBTQ writer community, I think just being part of the LGBT community at large kind of shaped my vision of Ben's experience. I feel like coming into my own sexuality as a gay man, I kind of was like looking for a community, and eventually I found that community in the DC area. Like the DC area has a vibrant LGBTQ community. When I was growing up, there was the Lambda Rising bookstore, which was the kind of a hub for like LGBTQ people, and like for me, that really opened up LGBTQ literature for me, and I really found like a community that really liked literature, that I kind of gravitated towards doing. Like I remember like going there as like a 17, 18-year-old, like 17-year-old, like not like fully out yet, but like kind of wandering there and just like being a shy person, just wanting to learn more. And like I remember the booksellers there, just like they knew I was shy, but like they led me towards like books that I felt that they felt were important to me as like a burgeoning like gay person. And I felt like that. Like I remember writing a particular scene in the book where like there's like a gay bar owner who like gives like Ben recommendations of like what to write, what to read, and I felt like that experience was really kind of like, I wouldn't say like it's like based on my own experience, but like the feeling of that nurturing community that is kind of out there looking out for you, and especially the next generation of like queer people. I kind of wanted to show that in Ben's journey, coming into himself as a gay man.
I love that. I love how throughout you're kind of talking about trying to capture the emotional register of all of these different experiences, you know, from how New Orleans feels to this particular scene. I really love that. And I think it leads us into this question from Jen Trahan, who says, I love that the dialogue addressed the gestation and generation of this beautiful book, and that Eric spoke to this book taking 7 years to write. I also love that this book was born in Eric's 3-year MFA program. Go McNeese. Does that make sense to you?
Yes.
Thinking about the 4 years that he spent working on the book post-graduation. So what advice do you have for writers out there who do not have these MFA communities or deadlines and accountability?
Hi, Jen. Jen was in my MFA program with me, and she read like the first drafts of this, which I'm like very thankful of. So advice for people out there who want to be writers but don't have communities or deadlines. I feel the most important thing to do as a writer is to like write. I feel like that's like very simple, but I feel like that's the most important thing I learned in my MFA program is like a writer writes. You have to put aside time to write. Sometimes that means like not going out, not like doing fun things. It means staying in to write. But I think community is also important. And I think even if you don't have a community, you can always seek one out. It could be online communities of other writers, other friends who might be writing. You can apply to like fellowships. A lot of them have scholarships, and that can lead you to other communities. Because I feel like there's like this mythology that writing is very like a lonely experience, and a lot of it is, but you also have a community out there for you. You need readers. You have not only readers, but like other writers who understand what it is to be writing something, and like a lot of the kind of pain that is sometimes just like that, like writer's block, for example. I don't think like non-writers would ever like really know exactly that particular feeling, but like just knowing other writers, like they know that. And I think even if you don't have a community, you can always seek one out, especially with like the age of Zoom. Like it's very kind of easy to meet if you have the technology available to you.
Speaking of communities and Zoom, can I ask how this publication experience in this strange time has been for you?
I guess I didn't really know what to expect. Like I kind of just woke up one day and hey, my book's on the shelf kind of thing. But I think it's been cool. I've had a lot of like virtual events. I feel like the Zoom atmosphere has made it like easier to connect with like bookstores and readers, because otherwise I would be traveling a lot and I feel like I would get really tired really easily from that. So like I feel like as a beginner, like debut writer, I'm kind of thankful because like this is kind of easing me into like a book tour schedule, and hopefully next time I'll be more ready and more energetic to like maybe do a travel schedule, maybe.
One thing that I want to ask on this note of, you know, living during this pandemic is I was struck by how letter writing is a very sustaining practice for Huong in the book. And I was wondering if you found any such sustaining practice for yourself over this past year of being at home.
I'm not sure. I feel like even before the pandemic, I kind of took like each day by itself. So I have like no clue as to like coping mechanisms for like the pandemic. As like I'm still here, but I guess writing and reading has always been like the cornerstone of my life, and like that's something that I've continued throughout the pandemic. That really grounds me. Just like taking like an hour or so a day to like really invest myself in a book. I feel like before the pandemic, like I could like ride the metro train and I'll get my reading in there. But I guess a challenge with the pandemic is like just trying to carve that space out, like because you're in your home all the time, you don't have that space to like the commute and then just zone out during your commute. So like just learning how to make that time for myself, I guess, is what helped me survive the pandemic.
Right. Because you're so right that it's not as if we have more time now, even though there's this strange assumption that that's true. It kind of feels like the day has collapsed, like all the borders have collapsed, and yeah, you can just keep working forever. I do want to say, since we have just a few minutes left, that I think Chelsea has put the link to buy the book in the chat, and I would highly recommend that you click on it before the Zoom closes. It's such a beautiful book. I keep thinking about it, highly recommend. Please do get a copy from Greenlight today if you don't have one. And then we have two questions from Trick Hess. The first one is, well, you answered part of it. So the other part of it is, did writing this book, did this story open up conversation within your own family about their experiences? And again, feel free to answer to the degree that you feel comfortable. And if you'd rather just go to the next question, we can do that too.
I think not really. Like again, my parents like haven't read stories so that they wouldn't like know how much of the like experience I've got right or got wrong. But I feel, at least for me, it brought me like a sense of closure. Like before this, I was kind of just really wondering like about that part of my family story, and like that was like like a question I always my parents had. My parents, but they always kind of pushed back. They kind of always taught me to think about the future, look forward. Kind of like a lot like Huong in the story. Who keeps like telling her kids to just look forward. But I feel through writing this novel, I kind of like I found a sense of closure on that. I've learned more about the Vietnamese refugee experience. I guess the question I was trying to answer while writing this was like, why would like someone leave their whole life behind, go out in the water, which is very dangerous, risk their lives, and then try to end up in a country where they don't know the language, where they basically have to start all over again, even if they were like a successful person back in their home country. And I think through writing this, I better understand the sacrifices my parents made, and what they've been through in their early years in the US. And I think I try my best to put myself in their shoes through the writing process. And I think for me, at least, I found closure in that.
The next part of their question is, I guess, what else are you writing about? Can we ask for a sneak peek at what you're working on now?
I'm the kind of writer who don't talk about I don't talk about what I'm writing just because like I feel like I might jinx it. So like I'm not gonna say anymore, but I feel like I'm kind of thinking about the same ideas I have in the first novel. I feel like kind of like each writer kind of have these obsessions that they return to, even if they don't understand that they're doing that. This idea like a writer writes basically the same story over and over again, just in different ways. And I feel like the theme that I really want to explore, at least now, is like memory. I feel like I explored that somewhat in Things We Lost in the Water, but I feel like it's just very interesting, like memory, not just like one's personal memory, but I'm thinking about like community memory. Like I'm thinking as like a Vietnamese American, like a person of the Vietnamese diaspora, how do you remember, for example, a fallen country that's not there anymore? As part of the LGBT community, I'm thinking about how do we as a community remember the AIDS pandemic, for example, when we have people like me who like were kids, were babies when that was happening. How do we remember that time period, especially as people who experience that or like they're dying out of like natural causes? What do we do with memory? So like I think memory is a place that I would like to explore more, and I feel like it's rich for exploration.
I love that because it is, of course, so powerfully present in this book already. And I'm excited to see the ways in which you push those questions forward. I have so many questions. I'm just looking at my Google Doc. Maybe I'll ask you one about writing time in this book, since we're talking about memory. One thing that I loved is how there are these big time jumps in the novel. The scale of the novel is really astonishing. And at the same time, there is such intimacy. There is such a sense of being really close to these characters. How did you manage time in this novel?
I think part of it was that I kind of wrote the novel out of order. So I feel like that helped me like stay like or remember like what kind of happens to the characters or what needs to happen to the characters. Like I think the second chapter that I wrote for this was when Tuan like wants to join the gang. So like I kind of have this idea there written down already that he needs to get to that point where being in a gang is something desirable to him. So I feel like kind of having an outline in a way really helped me like control time and like really get to know the characters, and in a way kind of backtrack in a way to kind of know where they need to be in the future and what needs to happen to them in the present to make sure they get to the future I want them to be at, to be present, to be inevitable for them to get there. Hope that answer your question.
Yeah, I think so. That's really helpful. It's helpful to think about how writing out of order can actually end up looking like a kind of planning, or it can help you hold the ideas in your head in a more interesting way. Since we only have a few minutes, maybe I'll get to one last question. But before that, I'll say thank you to everybody for coming. Thank you for your thoughtful questions. forgive me for saying for the millionth time that I love this book and I hope you'll read it. So my last question is, you already recommended Sarah Broom's The Yellow House. Are there other books you would like to recommend?
I think for me, the books that really helped me like write this, like the classics in my mind that I was kind of like aspiring to in a way, were like The Dew Breaker by Edwidge Benticat, which is about it's slipping my mind, but it's about like an executioner in Haiti, and he kind of flees Haiti, and it's about like how his life as an executioner kind of affects like different families. So I feel like that kind of helped me because that novel kind of was the constellation of different lives, and I wanted this novel I wrote, to be a constellation of different lives of like 3 family members. So that really helped me. Another one would be Hala Al-Yan's The Salt Houses, which is about a family who flee Palestine after I think a major bombing or like a war, and they flee to Syria and Jordan. And it's really about, it's a diasporic story about how a family kind of deals with displacement. And I think like those themes are really resonant in the writing of this book as well. So I highly recommend those 2 books.
That sounds great. Well, on that note, thank you so much, Eric. And thank you so much, Greenlight and Chelsea. Yeah, this was really great. I'm so glad I got to chat with you.
Yeah, thank you, Megha, for joining me in this, and thank you, Greenlight, for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much, Eric and Megha, for a wonderful conversation. And thank you to everyone who joined us and made this space for conversation and connection. A reminder that you can buy Eric and Megha's books at Greenlight. If you're local to Brooklyn, we're open noon to 7 for browsing or in-store pickup. If you want to give us a quick social distance visit, or you can shop online at Greenlight Bookstore 24/7 for in-store pickup or for shipping anywhere in the US. Thank you so much again, everyone, and please buy Eric and Megha's wonderful books, and everyone have a great rest of your evening. Night.
Thanks so much, Chelsea. Bye.
Thanks.